Up next, a discussion on countering violent extremism and ideology in the U.S. and around the world. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy hosted a forum Tuesday about the international efforts to curb the flow of foreign fighters into terrorist organizations like ISIS. This is 90 Minutes.
I'm Patrick Clausen, the Director of Research here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and thank you very much for coming today. First, an order of business, can I ask you to join with me in turning off your cell phone, not just silencing it, but actually turning it off, because then it's less likely to interfere with our and we are very pleased today for this policy forum on the battle of ideas of combating ISIS ideology at home and abroad. We are going to have an exciting program, and we are starting with remarks from His Royal Highness Prince Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, who's going to be joining us by video. And so let us start with the remarks from His Royal Highness, and then I will introduce our other two speakers who will have some prepared remarks and take questions and answers. So His Royal Highness Prince Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Previously, he served as Jordan's permanent representative to the United Nations and ambassador to the United States. And with that, His Royal Highness.
Thank you so much, dear friends. Good afternoon to all of you, and I apologize for not being able to make it down to DC for this discussion. And of course, our thoughts are with Rob and Jenny, and they're watching this on live stream, so I hope to connect with them soon. It's been a couple of years since I spoke to WINEP, and I've always enjoyed the interaction and the exchanges. I hope that you're getting this feed without any interruption, because I seem to hear that the sound is coming and going. So please have someone call my assistant, and she'll inform me if this isn't streaming clearly. I thought by beginning, of course, my statements to you, or my remarks to you, recalling the appalling events that took place in Peshawar this morning. We've all been shaken yet again by these horrific attacks, not just against civilians, but this time against a school with a large number of casualties being children, even as young as 2 years old. And I find myself almost in a state of permanent outrage. So continuous seems to be the stream of horrific events that we see on a daily basis around the world. I have to first of all say, and I've said this before in the UN Security Council and with the media, that really it's almost irrelevant distinguishing one group from another from a human rights perspective. Whether we talk about Boko Haram, or we talk about ISIS or ISIL, or we talk about Jabhat al-Nusra, you can continue to name one group after the other, of course, including al-Qaeda. They're all of the same ideology, the Takfiri ideology. And in this case, of course, the attack this morning perpetrated by the Taliban, but it shows the same callousness, the same disregard for life, the same or not just rather, but complete distortion of an understanding of what Islam is. And it pains me as the UN Human Rights Chief and a Muslim to have to see this time and again, not least because what worries me, and I have again spoken publicly about this both in Arabic and in English, what pains me is the relative silence of the Arab Muslim street in reaction to these events. We see condemnations streaming in from different Arab and Islamic capitals, but not enough in the way of popular demonstrations and popular expressions of disgust and disapproval. And I think it requires a much deeper sort of analysis than what we often see coming through to us via the media outlets. So it is clear to us, I think, in the human rights community, that tackling these groups militarily or through counterterrorism techniques or by choking off the funding is not enough. I mentioned in the Security Council 9 years ago, we had endless discussions about the criminal conduct of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, and then 9 years on, we find ourselves in Iraq with a different group, different name, but same ideology. Only the situation is much worse. And of course, the concerns both in Iraq and Syria are really quite pronounced. We listened very carefully in Geneva to the remarks made by Walid al-Muallim, the foreign minister of the Syrian government. And he was dismissive of the efficacy of the airstrikes. Now, this is something that I think has to be studied, because we have learned from other sources that this may well be the case, or at least if they were not supplemented by a concerted discussion within the Islamic world to confront line by line the thinking of the takfiri groups, that the results may not be what we hope they will be and fall sort of short of where we want them to be. The letter that I have alluded to, and that was the subject of a discussion between Robert Satloff and myself, and Rob is an old friend, was issued by 126 Muslim scholars back in September as a response to the July sermon issued by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And what I found really quite unfortunate is that this letter, which was remarkable in the sense that it was scholarly, it was backed by Muslim scholars from all over the world, it dealt by each of the points raised in the sermon, sort of a rebuttal by rebuttal, or rebuttal after, followed by another rebuttal to each of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's points, that this received far less in the way of media attention than the decisions to launch airstrikes and take very active military operations. Because I felt at the time, and still do, that this letter needs to be supported and alluded to and spoken about and referred to by politicians in the Islamic world and beyond. Not least because if it isn't shown that the Islamic world is responding, at least from a scholarly angle, then we will continue to see the phenomena we see in Europe and we saw in Germany yesterday of sort of demonstrations basically targeting Islam as a religion, as opposed to the takfiri ideology where the denunciations should be properly directed. And so we watch with horror day by day these developments, and we, all of us, in particular, those who occupy positions, senior positions in government or in the international community, must speak out and speak out forcefully. And particularly in the Islamic world, we need to encourage people, ordinary people, to understand the gravity of this and to speak out and voice their dissatisfaction, if not their complete disgust with what it is that they see. And so I will continue to make these points whenever I can, and I hope others will join me in doing so. It is a complicated world. We find that again, from a human rights perspective, there's still much to be, done and much left to be desired in terms of the conduct of a large number of states in respect of their human rights obligations. But insofar as this discussion is concerned, and what measures can be taken, and how we confront takfirism ideologically, I think this is a very appropriate discussion to be having. And I thank you for inviting me to take part. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that any of you have. I hope we can conduct a question and answer session upon the completion of this short presentation. And I look forward also at some stage to come and visit all our colleagues and friends at WINEP. So thank you very much for hosting this event, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if we can do that.
Thank you very much. I hope you could hear us as well as we could hear you. You came through loud and clear. So, and let me turn to perhaps to Matt to ask the first question.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it. We're holding this event here in Washington in advance of the long-planned White House CVE, Countering Violent Extremism Summit, which keeps getting postponed but will actually happen. And so I was wondering if you might be able to translate some of your comments for American policy. What would you like to see in American, or for that matter, Western European policies dealing with these problems? Of the 5 lines of effort dealing with ISIL, one of them is CVE. What are some of the things you would like to see from Western governments as part of their policies to deal with these issues in tandem with seeing greater Muslim and Arab statements dealing with the Takfiri ideology, and in tandem with seeing greater media coverage of statements, the letter, for example, from September?
No, it's a good question, Matt. I think the starting point is recognizing that there is a tissue that binds all these groups together, and in the past it was referred to as a sort of jihadist philosophy, but it doesn't quite convey who these people are. And I think if you were to isolate takfirism as the ideology, which is this pernicious way of thinking, very narrow and extreme in the way that they view the world, then I think we can begin to sort of create the right framework for a discussion. Because if it's left sort of fairly vague, and it's as if every group has its own ideology, it's not quite the same as saying, no, the ideology is uniform, it's just that they call themselves different things. I think it's an approach which would yield better results, not least because it will prevent at least the more populist-inclined politician, particularly in Europe, of stirring and whipping up anti-Islamic sentiment against migrants or immigrants living in Europe and elsewhere. And I think the dangers of overreaction only feed then the cause as they see it from the part of the Takfiris. I mean, what they have done, and I have again spoken about this quite clearly in the Security Council, is that they've cleverly seized upon this aspiration that many non-Takfiri Muslims hold for a caliphate or a khilafah. And by weaving it in with the extreme way of thinking, they have created a little bit of a juggernaut. I mean, it's interesting to note that Fallujah was occupied by ISIS a year ago now, and it's still under the control of ISIS. So it has resilience. The other thing that, of course, we've all begun to notice is that they're learning how to govern in certain places. They're being responsive to the needs of certain parts of the communities. So it's not blanket terror. It is terror in many respects, and certainly if you're an Azadi or a Yazidi, you live in fear of your life or for your life every minute of the day. but they're learning the art of governance, which will add to their resilience. And so a multi-pronged, complex response is required, and not just believing that through bomb and gun and the bank you can solve this particular set of problems.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to touch on the point you mentioned about Sheikh Yaqoubi's the fatwa that he wrote with the 152 other scholars. What do you, in the United States, we've always asked that the ideological portion of this problem be left to the Muslim community. So what do you think the Muslim can do to help empower these voices of mainstream scholars that are trying to speak out against ISIS, but don't really have a very large platform? So we've asked for the United States and other governments to stay out of this issue, but that kind of leaves no platform for them. So do you have any suggestions for how those voices can be heard?
Yeah, I think it's incumbent on the media to do this. I mean, it is shocking the way many of the media outlets would prefer to sort of show, rockets raining down on a particular location, rather than focus on also this other front, which is very much needed. And so again, when the letter was issued, this letter by 126 scholars, I saw 2 or 3 sort of newspapers in the Western world note that the letter had been issued, and I felt that there should have been much more coverage. And that those analysts who work for these large networks should also sort of think about this and should understand what is required and the nuance required here. Again, I go back to the point that I made earlier. Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi was decapitating people 9 years ago in Iraq. And after the Sahwa and the measures taken by the US and others, of course, they were rolled back, but they come back with a vengeance. And so the point has to be made that it's not simply through the criminal justice system or that through military means that this can be done. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. Perhaps it's not the role for the US government or other governments in the West to sort of take up the battle, but the ideological battle, so to speak. But at least the major international media outlets should shed some light on this, and I think this is the point to be made. I found it odd when I spoke in the UN Security Council. I started speaking in my statement in Arabic because I wanted to convey the contents of the letter in Arabic, and it was carried live by the Arab satellite channels. But what was interesting is that after that I had a press conference, and the Western press were largely not that interested in the contents of what I had to say when I left the Security Council. Now, subsequently there was some sort of reporting of it, but I think this tendency to almost, and I wouldn't want to be that critical by calling it sort of rather simplistic, but the tendency to focus on the sort of action, so to speak, rather than what may seem to be a drier method is perhaps where the problem lies. But I think in all the interviews that I have had subsequent to that discussion in the Security Council, I have raised the point time and again, and I hope others will do as well.
Could you discuss a little how we conduct the battle of ideas against isolated individuals, mostly in the West, who seem to be attracted to some of the ideas of these takfiris? Some of these people seem not too stable, such as the gentleman in Sydney yesterday. But what are the best ways for us to conduct a battle of ideas against these people who seem to be being radicalized mostly on their own through their contacts through the internet rather than through necessarily their contacts with other individuals in their communities?
Yeah, it's a very interesting problem. We do need to think about this very deeply. When I had a conversation recently with the High Commissioner for Refugees, my colleague and counterpart and friend, Antonio Guterres, he was saying it is clear that many who go to the conflict areas, Syria and Iraq, really know very little about the Takfiri ideology, but they see it as a vehicle for violent protest. They find that the traditional vehicles in Europe are no longer there. They're angry young men, and they perhaps have been brought up in a culture of violent video gaming, and for them this is an outlet. And so when you embroider all of this together, it looks really very grim indeed. And also we have a world which, you know, still stumbles around when it comes to accountability for the worst of crimes. We all denounce these crimes. We all call them disgusting and distressing. And yet we don't see still very much in the way of a concerted effort to end the impunity that exists for them. Worse still, and I can say this in my previous capacity as a member of the Security Council, an individual member, or representing my country, that there is a sense, in one way, that we are overexposed now to blood and killing, whether it be on YouTube or whether it be in the press. And you become deadened, you become absolutely numb. And I can tell you, when you sit through these briefings and you're told what ISIS is doing, or what the Shabiha were doing in Syria, or the Jabhat al-Nusra group, after a while, it's almost like being a first-year medical student dealing with your first cadaver. You are sickened perhaps by the smell of the formaldehyde. Second or third day, you get quite used to it. And the dangerous thing is that our publics are sort of getting used to it. The extreme now, which is a public decapitation shown on YouTube, evokes a reaction, or the killing of, you know, scores of children in Peshawar evokes a reaction. But the odd killing here or there, the odd bombing here or there, we've become so used to it. And so the public doesn't really react in the way that you expect the public to react. We've become too scattered in the way we've been bombarded by information. Our thinking is reflecting this sort of scattered way that the information reaches us. And so we need a sort of deeper thoughtfulness if we're going to confront all that we see. But I have to say to you, just anecdotally, and just in the number of times my office has to brief the Security Council on gross human rights violations, it is troubling. We feel almost that we're hurtling towards something, the exact contours of which we don't yet quite recognize in terms of a global emergency. And so we feel we're behind the curve. We're trying to catch up, and we need to be far more nimble and far more decisive in understanding what the issue is and then how to deal with it. The other day I was talking to a colleague representing our office in Afghanistan, and notwithstanding the attempts by many, not least many very brave Afghans, you know, the problems are still breathtakingly huge, and that can be said for other countries where the international community has made concerted attempts at trying to stabilize the situations there. And finally, if you'll just allow me one more point, Matt, you know, we've become very good at ending conflicts in many parts of the world. We sort of know how to end a conflict in a certain dimension. But what we're not good at is ending conflicts permanently. And here, because we don't understand what is required, what the algorithm is, that we must basically employ when you try and end a conflict, that it's not simply throwing cement at the problem, or training the military, or training the police, or training local officials, you know, clerks and administrative staff. We need much more than that. We need to understand the sort of the collective psychology of the people, the history, the disparate narratives. And only when you carefully consider these items can you then develop an algorithm whereby before you have reconciliation, you have deep reckoning. Otherwise, you're just floating around from one crisis to another, and seemingly scratching our heads all the time, wondering where did we go wrong and how do we get it right. So I think a complex response is required.
Very good. Questions from the audience, please. And let's start in the back there.
Yeah.
Please identify yourself first.
My name is Mary Carrick. You were talking about, the international community is good at stopping conflict. I don't know. I look at what we've done with Libya and Iraq. A lot of people want to do with Syria, which I think will just end up being another basket case. And then you mentioned training the military. For over 10 years, I've been hearing that we're trying to train their military, and it seems to be going nowhere, because I don't think their military wants to be trained, and we're wasting all this money on it. They had a military before, back in the 80s, when they were fighting against Iran and using chemical weapons.
Can I urge a question, please?
I just thinking why, I don't know if it's really a question, I guess. Maybe it's more of a statement, but,
Okay, thanks very much for your remarks. And next question, please. Right here in front.
Thank you. Bill Brana from the University of Maryland. So I think everybody in this room would agree that we need to focus and understand and address Takfiri ideology as a huge sort of source of ongoing conflict in multiple regions throughout the Muslim world. But one looks at the rise of ISIL over the last few years, and it seems to me that it's in response not just to Takfiri ideology, but the sectarian tension that really rose after the Arab Spring at a geopolitical level, and that they're just simply utilizing that sectarian tension effectively. And so I'm wondering, where would you rank the threat of a global sort of sectarian conflict compared to the threat of Takfiri ideology? And is one really worth addressing before the other, or at least allocating more resources towards than the other?
It's an excellent question. I had a meeting about 9 months ago with the World Bank, and we were discussing various conflicts around the world, and they said to me, in Syria, it really does look that you won't have any winners at the end. And I said, no, there's always a winner in conflict. There's always a winner. And as Bertolt Brecht showed us in Mother Courage and Her Children, the winner is the war profiteer. And the amount of money that's generated in many of these conflict areas is enormous through the smuggling of weapons and fuel and what have you. And so clearly you have a space where if there had been rule of law institutions that have collapsed, and by definition then that space is to be occupied by the criminal group or the extremist with a very clear sort of narrow worldview of the world. And the two can often be conjoined, which is happening, of course, in the case of Syria, and could be happening in the case of Iraq as well. And so you have this confluence of money, space, and extremist thought. Although, again, at the foot soldier level, I mean, what we've seen is that it's been quite a fluid situation. You may have fighters fighting with Jabhat al-Nusra that will cross over and fight for ISIS because they pay better, then may switch back to Jabhat al-Nusra because the terms of employment are better with them than with ISIS. So it's also a sort of fluid market like that. But there's no doubting that the instability then is exposed or another, and the better organized and the more simplistic the message, yet woven cleverly in with a general aspiration that most Muslims or many Muslims would have, is very clever and not to be underestimated, of course.
I know we promised that we'd let you go by 1 o'clock, but I'm hoping I can sneak in one last question, if that's all right, Your Highness.
Yeah.
All right, so right up here in front, please.
Hi, Salman Jalahma from the Embassy of Bahrain. My question to you, sir, is a lot of these people, particularly the youth that are, essentially sold on this idea of a caliphate and think that they will end up, whilst they're calling to actually head up and be part of this process. But once reaching there, realizing that this is not exactly what they signed up for and now want to go back. But now going back means that they'll be facing prosecution. So my question is, what can governments do essentially to focus on de-radicalization programs? And more importantly, how to use these individuals that return, dissatisfied with what they went for, using them as mediators rather than throwing them in jail?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I think you've hit both points on the head. Basically, there have to be programs in place for those who may have joined the ranks but themselves not having committed any crimes, at least clear that they haven't. They may have had logistical roles or administrative roles. And whether they can then be used to speak to youth in the sending countries or in the countries of origin. I shouldn't say sending countries, it's of course a term of art. In the countries of origin, I think would be a very clever way to address this. But it's clear that we have to think broadly and in a way that makes sense. There is also a discussion in New York, as yet sort of quite informal, that a number of the countries of origin are again states parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and shouldn't there be a sort of joint referral almost of all the nationals who hail from those countries, so that the court has some jurisdiction over those actions. And so those who have been involved clearly have been involved and have been photographed committing crimes, for instance, with multiple eyewitness testimonies, that there is accountability in store at some stage for the actions that they perpetrated. But I think your point is a very good one, and that needs to be considered very carefully.
Well, thank you very much, Your Royal Highness. We appreciate your presence very much, and we look forward to seeing you here again at the Washington Institute. So,
thank you so much. Thank you, and good luck. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And with that, let us transition to the second part of our program, which is remarks by our panelists here. First, we'll have some remarks from Matt Levitt, who is the former Wexler Fellow and Director of the Stein Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence at the Washington Institute, and has been very involved in these issues, the battle of ideas and countering violent extremism, always gallivanting across the world, being asked to speak at various places, testify in various situations. And then we will hear from Hedja Mira Ahmadi, who was an expert on community-based counter-radicalization programming. We had the pleasure of having her as an adjunct fellow at the Washington Institute for a while. And she's the president of WORD, which is an organization dedicated to promoting dialogue between Muslims and non-Muslims and strengthening moderate Muslim institutions worldwide. So first, Matt, and I'm hoping that he will start out by highlighting some of the Washington Institute's recent work on these issues.
Well, I will now, after my boss talks about my gallivanting. First of all, let me thank everyone for coming. This is the latest in our ongoing series of on our counterterrorism lecture series. And I was very, very pleased, even though he was unable to join us in person, that Prince Zeid was able to join us this way and take questions, which was not clear would be possible. I was very glad that we could. I have been gallivanting around the world. It's true, as Patrick and my wife keep telling me. But it's for good purposes. The most recent was this past week in Rome, where I gave a keynote talk on the issue of foreign fighters at the Global Counterterrorism Forum meeting on the subject, which was preceding this week's meeting, which is going on right now at the principal level in Marrakesh. And my friend from Bahrain, your questions are exactly what we spent 2 days talking about in Rome and what they're talking about in Marrakesh right now. In fact, let me make this all the more clear. First of all, we're worried about all these returnees. We are talking about more foreign fighters than all of the other jihadi conflicts we've seen in the past combined. We are nowhere near a point of seeing a plateau. So it's not just that we've surpassed those numbers. We're nowhere near done. The number of countries that people have come from is beyond anything we've seen before, upwards of 80. Most people put it at 84 right now, but the exact number is irrelevant, including countries that you never, ever would have thought. We're only talking right now about the Sunni side, by the way. There is a whole entire Shia Foreign Legion that is being created from Ivory Coast to Afghanistan, and that's another issue for another time. And one of the things we do have to consider is what to do with returnees. Both those who actually return, those who want to return. How do you assess if people are dangerous? Do you want to be the poor guy, maybe an FBI agent here or equivalent in France or Belgium, who interviews this individual and is forced to assess? I'm pretty sure that this person is not going to do something here, at least today. Because none of us have the capability of running surveillance on these individuals 24/7. Life is not like in the movies and on TV. So what do we do then? First of all, in the first instance, there's a big debate. Should we be telling people that if you come home, you will be put in jail automatically? Does that discourage people from coming home? On the other hand, by the way, at least in the United States and in several European countries, we can't prosecute everybody who comes home. In the United States, the biggest tool we have at our disposal is material support statute. Material support statute only applies to people who go and fight with designated terrorist entities. And in the case of Syria and Iraq, that right now, that only applies to al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, and ISIS. If you are fighting with any of the other dozens of groups, including in a battle alongside Jabhat al-Nusra, but technically as if wearing a sign around your chest saying, Ahr al-Sham, there's nothing we can do. And that's if we know. Our intelligence, all of our intelligence on the ground right now in Syria is not what we would like it to be. And guess what? Our adversaries are soon, if not already, getting smart. And they're going to stop doing the 19-year-old selfie thing and posing with a Jabhat al-Nusra headband or a decapitated head or a gun that shows that, no, despite the fact that you're coming back with a letter saying I worked for a charity, in fact, you were doing something militant. So our ability to deal with things are difficult. There's lots of great ideas in terms of exit programs. But for example, can that be mandatory? Can you force people to do that? These are very, very difficult questions. And I'll be very, very honest. Here in the United States, and that's what Hadi and I want to transition to now in this part of the program, I believe there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. We don't really do countering violent extremism particularly well in the truest sense of the word domestically, not for lack of interest, but simply because of the way we are structured. There's a lot of concern that there's problems at the federal, legal problems at the federal level, instructing state and locals how to do their business. Legitimate legal concerns. Establishment clause, freedom of expression. These are extraordinarily important things that define who we are, and they also complicate our ability to get into the weeds in terms of dealing with ideas. Government should not be getting involved in a religious debate. We're nowhere near capable on that. We have others in terms of NGOs, groups like Word that you'll hear about in a minute that are doing phenomenal work, but frankly, Word is the exception and is hopefully about to serve as a national model because it's such an exception, but I won't steal your thunder. I'll leave that to you. And so we need to think carefully about what it is we want to be doing here. What is the work that we're doing here? Well, right now, most of the work we're doing here is about outreach to communities. And that's important. Don't put that down one little bit. It's extraordinarily important to have healthy relationships with communities, including Muslim communities, and it's important to put that in the plural. There's no one singular Muslim community in this or any other country. But it is not enough. At a national, at a federal level, there is a community awareness briefing, the CAB, that the National Counterterrorism Center has put together, and NCTC officials travel the country and they meet with communities, and part of their dialogue is to give this evolving, because of events, PowerPoint. I wouldn't doubt it if, as of yesterday, the CAB has something in it about Sydney, to be able to explain to communities how we see the threat. It is primarily about the threat from radical Islamist extremism, takfirism, as we heard, but not only. Those are not the only threats that we face. And this is a very important part of the dialogue. When you're dealing with immigrant communities in general, of whatever religious or ethnic persuasion, many come from places in the world where having a relationship with law enforcement or intelligence is anathema. Right? You don't welcome that relationship because in many places in the world where people are coming from, that can't be good. And understanding that here it can be good, it is good, is something that has to be taught and learned, and a relationship that has to be earned. So it's great to do that. If that's all we are doing, we are doomed to tremendous and very fast and painful failure. One of the things that we are least comfortable about is having a discussion about ideology. And one of the reasons we have that discomfort, it's not just because of freedom of expression. It's not just because of the Establishment Clause. It's also because we are uncomfortable with the idea that ideas may lead to dangerous behaviors. We're uncomfortable, and that's why we don't talk about counter-radicalization anymore. We talk about countering violent extremism, which to my mind is an hour late and $1 short if they're already violent extremists. And the reason it's so uncomfortable here in the United States is that unlike, say, our counterparts in the United Kingdom, we don't have a federal-level Department of Community and Local Government. We don't have truly a home office as they do. And so, by default, our CVE, our HVEs, countering violent extremism, dealing with homegrown violent extremists, that whole side of our effort is by default housed within law enforcement, which is a big problem. I say that with all the love and respect for law enforcement and as someone who is former FBI. I don't want FBI or other law enforcement to be thought police in this country. And if someone is not responsible for moving the needle earlier in the process, not waiting till someone is a violent extremist, not waiting till something happens or is about to happen, but moving the needle earlier in the process to identify people who are at risk of having that cognitive opening to radical ideas, who are being presented with radical ideas and maybe not being presented with other ideas that might fill that space when they have the cognitive opening that can happen for any of a million reasons. Because of domestic issues, because of foreign policy issues, what have you, then we're not doing CVE. CVE to me, counter-radicalization to me, is getting involved earlier in the process and helping someone who might be along a path that leads to danger, helping them along another path. And we don't have enough programs like it. I think we only have one that really works, and you're about to hear about it in some detail. We also have a problem that we don't have enough funding for those programs that do exist. There are 3 big pilot programs that have been started around the country, run out of the U.S. Attorney's offices as CVE is now run in this country. They are in Boston, in Minneapolis, and in L.A. That's great. But the problem we are having is that there has not yet been, A, sufficient finance, money invested in this. So when people tell me, Matt, I'm telling you, there's tremendous attention to this at the highest levels of government, what I say is, show me the money. That's when I'll know that people are really interested and invested in this. The fact that someone's willing to have a conversation about it in and of itself doesn't impress me. And aside from having the funding, we also need to make sure that there is sufficient programming. These 3 pilot programs are a good start. They need to be focused on a risk-based analysis on where the greatest threats are. And without pointing at any particular religion, the fact of the matter is there's radicalism all over the place, but the global insurgency we're facing, the reason, frankly, that there's any interest and attention to this whatsoever in government is because of events having to do with al-Qaeda, ISIL in particular. Let's be very, very blunt. This is something that goes in waves. In 2009, the Institute wrote a report rewriting the narrative, a bipartisan report, got a lot of attention. It's available online at washingtoninstitute.org. You should read it. Unfortunately, a great percentage of it is still very, very applicable. The next year, we decided to do a follow-up report, also bipartisan, but a much smaller group, fighting the ideological battle to highlight the need to deal with the ideological issues. Again, read it, available at washingtoninstitute.org, still very, very applicable. We need to be able to have these conversations on the ground. You have to have programming that not only reaches out to communities, but addresses the ideological issues that are at the heart of what we're dealing with. But there's also, to be perfectly blunt, a major policy component to this, that DHS and NCTC and local and state law enforcement don't have any play in determining its outcome. And that is, frankly, our policy towards what's happening in the region and towards Syria in particular. And here, allow me to be very, very blunt. ISIS alone is not our problem. ISIS is a very critical part of the problem, to be sure, but it is not the sum total of our problem. I happen to think that a new authorization for the use of military force is a very, very good idea. But I also happen to think that one that is limited to ISIS is an incredibly poor idea, because the problem is not ISIS alone. And when it comes to violent extremism, Assad is at least as much of a problem. So long as Assad remains in power, he will serve as a magnet for foreign fighters. We have, on top of that, what I describe as a Sunni problem. Not a problem with Sunnis, but a problem with the way Sunnis perceive us and our attitudes and our commitment. Commitment goes back to the issue of what we did and didn't do when the president issued a red line over the chemical weapons, and I understand there's a big debate over that, but the issue is perception makes a difference. The larger issue is this. For a long time, we said we were not going to get involved militarily in this conflict, despite the fact that at the time, at a minimum, tens of thousands, probably already well over 100,000. Now it's, of course, well over 200,000 people, vast majority of them Sunnis, were butchered. Not just killed, but butchered. Women systemically raped, etc. Eventually, we said we might get involved militarily, but only to protect our diplomats in Baghdad and Erbil. And then we said, well, we might do more than protect our diplomats in Baghdad and Erbil. We may, if we can do this at minimal cost, we may also do something to protect minorities, Yazidis and others. That's great, but the message to our Sunni friends was, if we do get involved at all to protect people, it won't be to protect you. And that's a problem. And so over the past year and a half, as I've traveled the world, as Patrick noted, gallivanting, meeting with intelligence officials throughout Western Europe and North America, Australia, New Zealand, there's been one theme, especially before Iraq became what it is now. And that was that one of the reasons people were going wasn't for some offensive jihad. It wasn't necessarily then, though it's increasingly now, for some takfiri ideology. It was for many then, and for some still now, a defensive effort to protect fellow Sunnis. And why are you going? They would ask these individuals who returned. Because you haven't. Washington, Paris, Canberra. And that is a very, very dangerous phenomenon. And I think that there has to be a better marriage, not only between improved programming at home to deal with the radicalization process before it becomes violent extremism, it has to be married up with improved, I think, actual policy and certainly articulation and explanation of what our policies might be. One of the reasons this is so important, marrying these two, is that because of events on the ground, the nature of how things translate at home has changed. I'll give you an example. Our last counterterrorism event, we had Rob Bertoli, who's the Director General of the Dutch Intelligence Service, AIVD, speaking at this very podium, only a lot taller than me. And he pointed out to their newly released report, which is available online in multiple languages. The AIVD publishes about a report a year, declassified online, where one of the points that he highlighted was the shrinking space at home in the Netherlands. And having just been to the GCTF meeting in Rome, they're seeing this around the world. The shrinking space between political Salafists, or as they called them in the Netherlands, Dawa Salafists, and Salafi jihadis. Once upon a time, he noted, many people, though I contested it at the time, many people felt that one of the most effective ways to deal with the Salafi jihadis who really want to engage in violence is to enlist on your behalf the Salafis who have just as dangerous extremist ideas, but they're not actually looking to kill you right now. They can't do that anymore, the Dutch point out, even if you thought it was a good idea in the first place, which I would contest. Why can't you do it today? Because the space between them has shrunk. So many people are going to fight in Syria. So many people are going to fight in their own minds, true or not. Perception is what matters to establish a caliphate, that many of these political Salafi groups are no longer saying, no, you can't go do that, because this is legitimate. And there is an increasing overlap in that Venn diagram of space where it's not just the Salafi jihadis who are saying you should go and fight, but some of the political Salafis, and even those that aren't saying you should, almost all of them are being quiet and not contesting it, which means the nature of our problems at home are getting more complicated still. At the end of the day, what that means is that we need better programming at home. I live here in the United States. The fact that the United States of America does really creative programming on CVE abroad is great, but it doesn't give me any greater comfort for my 4 sons. And so we need a lot more work going on here. And with that, I'd like to introduce Hamir Maramati, who I believe has the most developed and successful program and model for that type of work so far yet in the United States.
That's such a tough act to follow. What am I going to say after that? Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Patrick. Thank you for the Washington Institute for hosting me. It's always a pleasure to be here. It feels like home. I want to bring this back to the community level and talk about how ISIS and the conflict in Syria is affecting us here at home. And I want to do it from a little bit of a historical perspective, because I think it's important to realize that the effect that ISIS is having here is in a way beyond anything we ever saw for al-Qaeda or any of the other jihadist recruitments. It was a much more extremist ideological indoctrination that happened with al-Qaeda that we're not seeing with the ISIS, because for al-Qaeda, they had to convince people that that the West was a mortal enemy, that they were going to use these brutal, inhumane tactics and a very warped sense of Islamic principles. But the ISIS message is different, and Matt's pointed this out, and so did Prince Zeid. But I'm referring to their propaganda, not our portrayal of what they say on the news. So according to their propaganda, they're building this utopian society. They're saving Muslims from the hands of a regime that's slaughtering its own citizens or severely oppressing them in Iraq. They portray themselves as a legally valid and justified leaders of a functioning state. The internet, if you take the time to watch some of these propaganda videos, I've watched way too many of them, but the ISIS militants are coming in and saving the day. They have clips, very long clips, 20-minute clips about court appearances, very similar to Judge Judy, where they show these adjudications for people who've been living without laws for years. They adjudicate marital disputes, inheritance, property rights, and they portray this for the rest of the world to watch. You want to know why they're recruiting so many young girls, 3 girls in Denver, the girls in the UK, Germany? I encourage you to watch some of these videos. Some of these guys are really handsome. So they come across as these strong and righteous heroes who help little old ladies cross the street, taking food out of dumpsters, and they hand them money and resources, and then telling the camera, look at the way our people are being treated. This old lady's eating out of a trash can. So this is a very romantic myth. They're not telling people come and bomb a marketplace with babies in it. They're telling people come and join this utopia. So what do we do? So how, at the grassroots level and from the ideological perspective, do we debunk this romanticized myth that they portray? So as Prince Zeid mentioned, the need for Islamic scholars to refute their arguments. And some people, I know they discredit this. They say, oh, well, a lot of people are not listening to these scholars. If you look at the video that Sheikh Hamza Yusuf put out about this, there was 250,000 hits on that video. That's not insignificant. So these messages are important, and for the most important reason, they are inoculating the middle. They are taking the kids that are on the fence or on the edge or even in the middle, saying to them, hey, look, if you get any ideas about this, this version of the caliphate that they're talking about, let me tell you what the truth is. And so I want to tell you some of these arguments, because I'm happy to say these rebuttals and these debunking of the ISIS narrative by these scholars has been done for the first time. So in the past, occasionally you got Qaradawi and others giving a fatwa and then revoking the fatwa and changing the fatwa if it's in Israel versus Iraq. But now we're seeing very strong statements that are being broadcasted all over the world, and with the help of social media are being seen by thousands of individuals. So the first one is, as I mentioned, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's, and it was, I guess, so popular that ISIS actually did a rebuttal video against his video. But he talks about the fact that the ISIS are Khawarij. And the Khawarij are this group that the Prophet Muhammad foretold about people that would be very eloquent in Islam, that would pray, and it's that even their prayer and their fasting would make people, other Muslims, envious, but that they were brutal heretics, and that if you join them, you would be a heretic along with them. And so he talks about how the fact that, you need to think twice about this because I believe that ISIS represents this Khawarij that the Prophet Muhammad foretold. And then even Islamist clerics like Yusuf Qaradawi says that ISIS hasn't met the valid conditions of an Islamic State and therefore is illegitimate. And he justifies that both on sociological grounds and theological grounds. Very elaborate fatwa that he's given as well. Another scholar, Sheikh Gabani, he warns his students that of another prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad about the end of days, where he says that the killer won't know why he killed, and the killed won't know why he was killed, and that there was this great confusion that would start, and it's a fitna, as it's described in Arabic for Muslims, and that you needed to stay out of it. And this helps, especially in the Middle East, where people are saying that there's this dichotomy between Assad doing the killing and ISIS defending the people that Assad is killing, and the Sunnis being oppressed, and saying, listen, this is a fight you should have no part in, because again, it's nothing but confusion and dangerous deviation. And then there's the fatwa that Prince Zeid referenced that had over 100 scholars that signed on by the Syrian exiled scholar Sheikh Ya'qubi, and he denounces them on a plethora of legal grounds. He takes everything from the rules of jihad, the principles of the maqasid, of the justice of mercy in Islamic jurisprudence, and also takes up a number of conditions for why ISIS needs to be that is delegitimate and that nobody should be going over there to help defend them. These are very powerful themes by very influential scholars. But the thing is, they need to be told louder. They need to be told to more people. They need to have a platform so that more young people and vulnerable people are able to hear this message. So at the community level, my organization, as Matt so kindly explained, we run an intervention program. And I'd like to say that this is a prevention of violent extremism program, a PVE program. We never get tired of acronyms here in Washington. So our program is run in partnership with our county stakeholders, our health and human services, our schools, our county government. It's actually an initiative under the county executive's office. And we're trying to help young people and vulnerable individuals way before they're indoctrinated. But even in this space, the issue of war in Syria is very real. Let me give you some concrete examples. For example, for a lot of young people, they are not familiar or aren't clear on the concept of an extrajudicial killing. That even in Islam, where they believe there's an eye for an eye, you can't just go and kill somebody who you think has harmed you. So I'm not quite sure whether this comes from a cultural tradition or a tribal understanding, but there's this very strong sense that revenge is an integral part of Islam. And for mainstream Islam, it's definitely much more complicated than that, and it's something that young people need to understand. They also don't know it's illegal to travel to Syria. So they think it's just about getting a plane ticket. So it's not necessarily broadcasted enough that this is absolutely illegal. You cannot go over to Syria and fight. For many of them, they're just really sad to see the images. They want to pray for the killing to stop, but what do they do if it doesn't? So what if God doesn't answer the prayers and the massacring of Syrian civilians continues, or the persecution of Sunnis in Iraq continues? What do they do with the feelings of powerlessness and hopelessness? And many of them have serious problems with authority. They don't respect their parents, they don't respect school teachers, and then how do you inculcate important values when there is this complete lack of respect for the legitimate place of authority in their lives? So our clinicians take a range of issues that may be presented and try to use self-exploration techniques and motivational interviewing to try to get at the root of why they have these attitudes and or behaviors, and trying to steer them towards more ethically and morally responsible choices. They're also trying to empower them with nonviolent skills like means of expression, like youth media, songwriting, peer mentoring, being there for their peers who are feeling sad, depressed, angry, volatile, violent, and being able to infuse mental wellness in their everyday understanding of what it means to be a peer mentor. And also advocacy skills. We're trying to help them feel like they can overcome feelings of powerlessness or of helplessness. And so, as you can imagine, it's really important to get at these issues early. So what do? How do we stop the recruitment? And Matt mentioned a couple of really important points. And as I mentioned, for debunking the myth, as I mentioned to Prince Zeid, there's this issue of whether the U.S. government should get involved in ideology, and I absolutely respect that we do not want them, and they probably get it wrong, which version of Islam, good Muslim versus bad Muslim, but they can do things to empower the voices that are speaking out against ISIS, whether it's hosting conferences, publicizing their material, giving them social media skills to get the message out in a more effective way. I think we really need to do these kinds of activities, and we need to do it in a big way. I'm hoping that we could develop some kind of a counter movement, whether it originates in the Middle East or here in the West, that motivates young people to realize what Islam does stand for. So not just what it doesn't stand for, but what Islam does stand for. Upholding the legacy of the Prophet in the terms of fairness and mercy, or defending social justice, or demonstrating good moral character. And so for PVE, Preventing Violent Extremism, or CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, there needs to be more funding for community-based programs. We're lucky to have funding from our county executive, who believed in our program early on, but I think it's very, very important that there be federal directives down to the local level explaining why these partnerships are important, and again, making sure that they are partnerships so that the community has an active role in the intervention and the prevention, especially when they're in the ideological space. And for those of us who do interventions, we need clearer guidelines. There needs to be clear guidelines about what the national security exemptions are in the HIPAA statutes, the healthcare and medical laws. What is an imminent threat of harm in the violent extremism arena? Because you may understand it in terms of homicidal, suicidal tendencies, but what does it mean in the violent extremism space? And that's something me and my clinicians grapple with almost every day. So we need better directives between community and law enforcement, and hopefully some more directives to the Board of Education and Health and Human Services at the federal level that will then trickle down to the states to know they should also be designing programs that prevent violence for at-risk and vulnerable populations, especially as it relates to violent extremism. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So I certainly have questions, and I'm going to hop in later, though. And let's start with the audience questions, please. So if we could, the gentleman right here.
Hello? Good. Thank you very much for your comments, Mr. Levitt and Ms.
Please identify yourself.
Oh, of course. Herbert Tinsley. I'm with the University of Maryland. I wanted to direct my question specifically to this notion of, on the one hand, we have fatwa that are discussing the notion of khawarij and fitna and so forth, these very traditional narratives. And then on the other hand, we have programs like yours, which are cutting edge and attempting to deal with the actual ideas that need to be disabused. That is to say, what is it that makes these people potential recruits? It's the fact that they don't know that they can't legally travel to Syria, so on and so forth. So that seems to show that there might be a gap between the theological community, as it were, and those who are actually trying to operationalize this preventative program. So I'm wondering, what sort of engagement would you suggest, or what sort of engagement is possible between the shuyukh and those of you who are actually trying to work with potential recruits?
It's a great question. I think the issue, I meant to portray them as the whole universe of things that are going on, because I think you need both. So what the shuyukh are doing is affecting a lot of the older kids and the older adults that are interested in the justifications before they go, and the youngsters are just not, they're not there yet. So I think it's not that there's necessarily a disconnect. There is a vulnerability for sure, but our model in particular is trying to address the multitude of risk factors. So ideology we've clustered as one of the set of risk factors, but there's also these other political grievances, sociological factors, psychological factors, and economic factors. So we see them as clusters of risk factors. So what I see in the young people is that they also have a whole host of the other factors that we need to address. But to your point, it's really important that there be, and that's what I mentioned about conferences, I'm starting to see a trickle of these mainstream scholars come to the United States in a way that I haven't seen before, and I don't know if that's thanks to the U.S. government, but there are a number of these what we call road shows happening now in the United States, and we just need more of them. We just need more of them. I mean, I know Sheikh Yacoubi came to Adams Center a month ago, and people were surprised by the comments he made because he was really forceful in his condemnations of extremism, and those are just welcome activities, and just doing more of them.
I'd just add that, you know, this gets to the point of having to engage in activities across the spectrum. Right. If you only deal with the Islamic concepts, not enough. If you do all the other things and you don't deal with those concepts, also not enough. Because for different people, you know, different factors are going to be more prominent. One of the problems we've been saying it for a long time up here, I'm going to say it again, even though every time I say it, there's at least one person in the audience who gets very angry at me. So be it. The truth is, the problem isn't Islam per se. For a lot of these kids, there's not enough Islam. That is to say, they don't understand their religion enough. They get involved, especially some of the converts, but not only, but they don't actually understand these ideas. And there's a gap, therefore. They're driven by simple, often off explanations that drive people to go, but they don't have quite enough knowledge base to then be able to have the conversation about what these concepts really mean. And so teaching someone, you know, arithmetic and division enough to be able to get by in basic math, but then not being able to have a conversation with them about calculus because they missed that medium. If we don't engage in a conversation about the ideological components, we're going to fail. If that's all we do, we're going to fail.
Can I ask you a question about what kind of message that we want to bring to these people? I mean, I'd be delighted if these individuals that you're trying to reach decided that they'd like to fit into the mainstream of American society and the mainstream of the American political system. But if they are going to be holding, shall we say, extreme political views, and in fact, if they're going to despise people who are different from them, so long as they don't use violence, that's okay.
That's Congress.
What kind of a message are we going to bring to these people who in many cases seem to be very disaffected with the society they're in? Are we going to try and persuade them to become part of the American mainstream? Or are we going to try and tell them, look, it's okay to hate Christians and Jews, but just don't go out and kill them?
Well, I think that's what Matt brought up. We started there with the whole distinction between political Salafists and jihadist Salafists is that, you know, it was no jihad till Tuesday. It was just about delaying the jihad because we're in a peace treaty with the West, and therefore, until that treaty is broken, there is no jihad. And I don't think that's a healthy perspective. I know for us, we're trying to give them the skills to allow them to be participants in the mainstream and to feel empowered because, as I said, a lot of them have a lot of other issues going on. They feel alienated. They feel disaffected and disenchanted with the way the system is treating them for a variety of reasons. Either they came as refugees or their parents are out of work or other reasons or what they've been taught in Sunday school. Whatever the case may be, I believe, at least for us, the focus is to help make them into better people. And that's not just no jihad till Tuesday, as far as I'm concerned.
That's absolutely the case. But there's also, the truth is, there are steps. And so, you know, the first step has to be walking someone off the edge of the cliff of wanting to do something violent. And then the next step is, you know, giving them a broader ideological perspective. One of the things we haven't discussed is that a lot of the radicalizing factors that have been around for a long time, they continue to be there. The problem of belonging and identity. You know, at some of the conferences I've been attending, one of the themes that comes up country after country after country is that the vast majority of people who have gone to fight for altruistic or really bad reasons are from broken homes. It's a younger demographic. It's not just men, it's women. But it's a lot of it, not only, but a lot of it has to do with, as you said, people who don't have a respect for authority. There are issues in the house. There is something about the jihadi cool. There is something about the sense of belonging and empowerment, and it's just happening in a context that is so much more volatile, in part, as Bill said, because of the sectarian issue, which whatever happens in this region, in this world, the one thing I guarantee you we'll still be talking about 2 decades from now is the repercussions and the continuing sectarian repercussions, I fear then, of what's happening right now.
Absolutely.
I stop there.
Sir.
Thank you. Howard Sumka, former USAID. I'm wondering, Hedia, how you do your partnerships in the community. I'm really wondering which county executive you're talking about, so maybe you could mention that. and to what extent you, first of all, bring in families and center some of your work in the schools. And then another aspect of it, it seems to me, is not just working with the Muslim kids, but in the school context, working with the non-Muslim kids, because the worst thing is when the Muslim kids feel totally excluded and isolated and harassed.
Sorry, I didn't go into that in great detail. A lot of people have heard my explanation of my model, so I so try to spare you that. It's our Montgomery County. It's the Montgomery County Executive. And what we're famous for is the fact that it is not Muslim-centric. It is an all-of-community model because we believe it functions like an early warning system. We're not trying to stigmatize the Muslim community because especially since a lot of the recent instances of foreign fighters are converts, so they've grown up in a house that did not practice Islam, and actually they're radicalizing in 3 to 6 month intervals in some cases. So it's not as if they know that much about Islam at all. So our model is all about having a community that understands what the risk factors are, and as I mentioned, the multitude of risk factors, and then deciding how are they going to intervene. So it's educating teachers, school counselors, student resource officers of the police department, together with our faith community partners, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, and Sikhs, and then talking about how we make sure we intervene and provide them assistance before they turn to violence. That's why we're not a de-radicalization program. We are a preventing radicalization program.
DRAD is infinitely harder, by the way.
Yes, infinitely harder.
We want to get it right now, and when you can actually have a much better impact.
Exactly.
And I would just highlight 10 times over the point that Hedia just made about the shrunken window of radicalization. Everywhere, this is what people are talking about. This model in the past where someone would have to go over a period of time and be radicalized, often in person, it's yesterday's model. We're talking about a week and a half to 2 weeks in some cases. People who are never on your radar and shouldn't have been on your radar, and all of a sudden they are because they've traveled. And one of the biggest problems is that it's not happening in mosques. It's not happening even in your storefront mosque or in your bookshop, meaning in your subculture mosque. It's happening online. And the social media phenomenon here is tremendous. Perhaps most, in many, many ways, but I'd highlight just 2. One is that this is a 2-way conversation. It's not just a 1-way conversation. And you can literally talk to someone, often someone who came from your neighborhood. What's it like there? By the way, what type of North Face jacket should I bring if I go? And what do the guys want? It's usually Nutella. And it is, not peanut butter. So this 2-way conversation. The second thing is, instead of being elitist, as it once was, behind closed forums, etc., it's now completely open. It's Twitter and Facebook and Ask Me and some very popular Russian platforms, etc. And this has just made it available in all kinds of ways. And what tends to happen is that we're talking past each other. So we look at the nasty, nasty beheading videos that ISIS puts out there. The people we're concerned about being radicalized are looking at the videos that Hedaya described. And we're not even talking to each other. So on the one hand, it's wonderful that people are paying attention to this issue again, right? Unfortunately, because things are so bad, right? This CVE is one of the 5 lines of operation against ISIS. That's great. But if you look at the recent congressional testimonies by U.S. officials talking about this, and you look eagerly, expectantly, perhaps as I did, for what are they pointing to? What is the CVE that we're doing now in the context of this incredible problem? What's our big answer? It's not so big. Some good stuff, CSCC, strategic messaging out of the State Department. That's great. Counter-tweeting, it's very interesting. It's part of the package. I'd argue it's a small part of the package. A nice one. If that's the only thing we have to put forward, that can't be the package. It can be part of the package. But again, it would be, to me, it's part of the talking past each other. The key demographics that we need to be reaching, they're not paying any attention, or very little attention if you want to be generous, to the CSCC tweets.
Over here, please.
Thank you. Again, Omari, and I'm going to take the conversation back to theology, if I may. I was heartened by what you mentioned here about some of the fatwas and whatnot, but in the big picture, I'm still very pessimistic because these are small voices, as you said, and they run counter to the established religions, the religious authorities in the Arab world, at least in the Arab world. And that's not only the kind of jihadi, takfiri, but also the other Salafi, and also the Muslim Brotherhood, and also the Wahhabi, and the Azhari, and all of that. And at some point, when you want to counter it in the region, systematically you hit these institutions, and with that you hit the state apparatus as well. So I'm very pessimistic about there. So my question is about here, in the United States. Are we seeing development of other types of Islamic ideologies in the United States? Are we seeing a theology emerging from here that will counter the theology coming from there? If so, how do you sustain something like this? Where does this get funding from, given the fact that money from the region is coming here to sustain the other radicalizing kind of ideologies? So are we starting to have an American Islam? And if so, how do we support this American Islam? Thank you.
Sure. Can I address the first point? Because I think we are seeing, especially with the change in Egypt, we're seeing Azhar trying to take a more positive role in this. I think whether it was under Osama al-Abd or our new Mufti of Azhar, whose name is suddenly escaping me, and also with the UAE. So Sheikh bin Bayez Muslim Peace Forum is also officially sponsored by the Emiratis. I think there is an effort, albeit small compared to the opposing forces, there is an effort to try and promote a more moderate theology. And like I said, I'm seeing a number of road shows, so I think somebody's paying for these. I can't figure out who's paying for them. But I think it is really important to have that connection to these international figures. Some of these scholars live here, but there is an incredible amount of deference paid to these international scholars. They have weight in the Muslim community, even with American Islam. So we have scholars here that are developing somewhat of a cult following. There's Imam Sohaib Webb and Sheikh Hamza too, and I don't know if it's an American Islam or it's a version of traditional Islam adapted for America. I think that story is yet to be written. But I mean, there seems to be a tremendous influence of Sufism in it as well. And I think that's from Sheikh Yaqubi, that's from Sheikh Hamza, of course from Sheikh Kabani too, and Imam Webb I'm not as certain about, but Sufism also seems to be a big part because I think people see it as the counter movement because it involves music, it involves the nasheeds. It's basically in response to the ISIS nasheeds as well, and it has a much more colorful, artful, historical significance, I guess, that they're utilizing as well.
Thank you. Let's see. Oh, way in the back. I'm sorry. Missing. Thank you.
Hey, Matt, Hediam, thank you for the great presentations. Special Agent David Kane with Homeland Security Investigations. Since we're on the subject of CVE, I want to throw this question out in light of the release of the CIA report. How bad do you see the fallout vis-a-vis CVE radicalization as well as recruitment for ISIS, for JAN, for these organizations engaging in terrorism in the Middle East? with the release of this report. So you can comment on that a little bit.
Thank you for coming. No, I've actually, you know, there's been some interesting stuff out there already, and especially in social media, about, in some ways, how little this is played in the region. Yeah, I think that, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to put a colorful spin on this. This is going to be complicated. But people expect, in the region, people sometimes expect this is going to happen. Other countries are not coming forward with the report. The fact that this activity happened is obviously very, very bad, right? The fact that we as a country can investigate ourselves this way and do it publicly and air the laundry and fight it out, and this is what we're about. And this says a lot about who we are. We're not above making mistakes. This is wonderful meat for propaganda. There's no question. So is Sydney, which had nothing to do with any of this. So is Ferguson, which had nothing to do with any of this. So our adversaries will try and use, for propaganda purposes, what they can. I honestly don't think that this is going to be a particularly successful piece, because at the end of the day, the bigger discussion, the bigger issue is that we're coming clean. We're having this discussion out there. Read the report, as the hashtag says. It may be painful and uncomfortable reading, but anybody out there can read this report. I think that says a lot.
Up front, please.
Yes, my name's Dave.
Microphone's on. Coming your way.
You know Dave, right? You know Dave, right? I talk faster than she runs. My name is Dave Williams, and this is for Hadia. How do you measure success in what you're doing? Do you have established metrics for success, or?
Yes, absolutely. Very important.
That's why I asked it.
Plant that question.
Every CVE conference, all of us, we go to like, oh, the metrics question, here it comes. No, we are, so for, our program is run under a healthcare system, so we do follow the rules of HIPAA, but we also are able, as a consequence, to do pre and post evaluations and assessments of our clients. So we're able to use developmental scales that have existed in measuring tendencies to violence in other psychological studies, and we do pre and post assessments that way. And we also have developed a questionnaire that is the result of research we did with the University of Maryland, so it's semi-validated research questions that we also ask our clients to measure the risk factors that they may be vulnerable to. And then again, before we discharge them, we do another assessment at the end to see how they've moved. And for us, that's a way of demonstrating that we have a client that demonstrated risk factors, and we reduced those risk factors. And so this is all dependent on our CVE framework that we use. And so we base reducing the risk factors on that CVE framework. And I'm happy to share more of that with you. But that's the way we measure our metrics.
Thank you.
One of the reasons it's so important to do this at the local level isn't just because this is happening at the local level, but because this type of ingenuity and creativity can happen there and work there. I'm referring to the fact that at the federal level, we've had a hard time getting the social, positive face of government wholly involved and invested in the CVE process. When the conversation started, people came and said, listen, by default, you're going to house us within law enforcement because you have nowhere else. Fine. But this, you can't, as the British and others in Europe put it, you can't securitize this relationship. You have to have the positive face of government out there too, whether it's in the community engagement or other types of activity. In extremists, you don't want an FBI agent meeting with you one day for community engagement and then being involved a few days later in a raid on someone in the community who might have been involved in some illicit or illegal conduct. And in the first instance, we got some buy-in. Now there's a lot of pushback. And now you have the HHS, Health and Human Services, Department of Education in some instances, pushing back and saying, no, we don't want to get too involved because we don't want you to securitize our relationship. And that's a problem. And that will only get fixed when there's a top-down instruction at the highest levels that here's how my federal agencies and departments are going to function. FBI, DHS, NCTC can only ask nicely. At the end of the day, for these programs to work effectively at the federal level, even just in terms of directing federal monies, tapping into existing federal programs, from big stuff at HHS, where there's a whole apparatus focused to these types of issues, to even at my former Department of the Treasury, where there are funds to teach financial literacy, which, for example, when we went out to Minnesota, after we realized the extent of the problem there in recruitment for Shabab, we realized people were so unacculturated into American culture. Many people just didn't know basic financial literacy, bank accounts, credit cards, checks. These are things that can be very effective, and you do them because they need to be done, and there's a Venn diagram overlap. Yes, it'll also benefit from a CVE perspective, and we have to make the social or positive face of government more comfortable in getting more involved in that at the federal level. And Hidaya's program, it's working because that's how it's structured, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it's when we do the training for the student resource officers for the police, they tell us, oh, this looks very much like our gang prevention model. So they recognize all the same the same system in which you tackle these kind of issues. And so for us, it would be so much easier if all of that expertise came to bear on this problem. In other words, all the programs that we've done and the research we've done in the law enforcement field or in HHS and in the Board of Education about violence prevention and gang prevention and brought that to bear on this issue set, I think we'd be a lot more successful by now. And it's just, for us, we're just doing it at the local level using our county stakeholders, and we're very fortunate that we have the county's support to allow us to tap into these different resources, but you'd have to replicate that receptibility in every county and every city if it doesn't come top down.
I must tell you that we have a lot of forums here at the Washington Institute, and typically at the end of our forums, people leave much more depressed than when they came. We've been at times accused of designing our forum program to make people more worried. But I don't know about everybody else here, but I at least am more optimistic and hopeful than when I came, and I think that we should end this very much on an upbeat note, and so please join me in thanking our speakers, and I look forward to seeing you again when I can promise you that it'll be less optimistic.